So good afternoon. Thank you all for turning out in this very sad, dreary weather. And my apologies to anyone who was rained on exceptionally hard as you made the approach to Croon Hall. But this is such a lovely building. The warm wood, I hope everyone will warm up very quickly as we begin today's program. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this fall semester's Chubb Fellowship Lecture with our distinguished guest, Ambassador João Vale de Almeida, the head of the European Union delegation to the United Nations. Now, before we begin, I just want to ask everyone to turn off all cell phones and refrain from taking any photographs, with the exception of our staff photographer. This way, we will make sure that the program will not be interrupted this afternoon. And for those of you who do not know who I am, my name is Mary Liu. I'm a professor in the Department of History and the program in American Studies. I'm also the current head of Timothy Dwight College. As the head of Timothy Dwight College, I have the honor of serving as the custodian of the illustrious Chubb Fellowship, established in 1941 out of a prior large donation for education purposes. This was made in 1936 by Hendon Chubb, who graduated from the Yale class of 1895. Since establishment, the Chubb Fund has adhered to the goals of providing encouragement and aid to students interested in government and American public affairs. The fellowship initially aimed to foster among Yale undergraduates an interest in public service in local and state affairs, and it grew over the years to include numerous distinguished visitors in national and international affairs, as well as leaders in the world of the arts and humanities. Since the 1940s, the Chubb Fellows Lecture Series has inspired generations of Yale students to undertake public service and pursue leadership roles in the hopes of creating a better world today and for posterity. The fellowship has hosted 4 U.S. presidents: George W. Bush, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Harry Truman. In recent years, we've welcomed a wide range of national and international leaders, including Wynton Marsalis, Aung San Suu Kyi, and Shah Rukh Khan. With this quick description of the history and aims of the Chubb Fellowship, I'm delighted that we're welcoming to Yale today Ambassador João Vale de Almeida. Now, introducing the ambassador will be Professor James Levinson, who is a TD Fellow. He's the Charles W. Goodyear Professor in Global Affairs at Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and Professor of Economics and Management at the Yale School of Management. Professor Levinson is the founding director of the Jackson Institute, and in that capacity, he oversees the Global Affairs major in Yale College, the Global Affairs MA, and the Yale World Fellows Program. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. His current academic research is focused on estimation of the impacts of internal migration on household well-being in South Africa and estimating the demand for sanitation in Bangladesh. So please join me in welcoming Professor Levinson to the podium, who will give his introduction of the ambassador.
Thank you, Mary. It's an honor to be able to introduce João Vale de Almeida. Ambassador Vale de Almeida is a senior European Union diplomat. He was appointed as EU ambassador to the United Nations in October 2015. Prior to leading the EU delegation to the UN, the ambassador served as the first EU ambassador to the United States. During this period, he was critical to the launching of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, an ambitious free trade agreement that is, or perhaps was, being negotiated. From 2004 to 2009, Ambassador Vale de Almeida was Chief of Staff for EU President José Manuel Barroso. The ambassador is originally from Portugal, which is why I turned to our own Professor Nuno Monteiro when I wondered how the ambassador's last name should be pronounced. Nuno bears no responsibility for my mangling. We are fortunate to have Ambassador Vale de Almeida today, as there are so many pressing EU-related issues. We are witnessing the largest migration in Europe since the close of the Second World War, and from where I sit, this seems to be putting existential stresses on the EU. We've witnessed Brexit, our own election here about 3 weeks ago, and several key elections are forthcoming on the continent. The future of the Paris Climate Agreement is unclear, and the U.S. position on many other important international issues moving forward is uncertain. In this environment, it's a special opportunity to hear from the EU's ambassador to the UN. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador João Vale de Almeida.
Good evening. Thank you for coming today in spite of the weather. It's a great honor and great pleasure to be here. My name is João Vale de Almeida, which is a slightly different pronunciation than I prefer. But, you know, I've been long enough time in this job to accept creativity. And when my kids call me or my wife calls me, it sounds a bit strange because it's the real pronunciation. But it shows the diversity in which we live in and live with. And it's good. It's good to be called my name in different pronunciations, as it is to be able to engage with the different people around the world, as it is to discuss and be faced with different opinions. This is what democracy is. This is what globalization is. This is what pluralistic society is. And it's always good to be able to discuss with people like you, faculty and students, and people interested in global affairs. It's also good to come out of New York and come out of the United Nations and be in such a beautiful and environmentally sustainable building and be with such nice people. And I just had a wonderful conversation with a number of members of the faculty here. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight. I'd like to thank the professor for, introducing me. And I hope I didn't destroy the whole operation here. Is this the right one? Yeah. Thank you, Professor Marilu, for organizing this. My good friend, Mary Evelyn Tucker, for being at the heart and the beginning of all this operation. Thank you all. Thank you, the school, for hosting us as well. It's, again, a real pleasure, a real honor to be able to be here to discuss with you. What can I do to help you understand better the way the world goes these days? I think that will be my initial purpose, and I will be, I'm absolutely confident that I can describe the world as it is today in 20 minutes, which will leave plenty of time for you to question everything I would have said and prove me wrong on all my assertions. But let me try to do that in a sort of telegraphic way. So, and using where I am today at the United Nations, but what I did before that as a basis and the background for my view of the world today. I think if you listen to the debate, you have basically two ways of looking at the world today. Two sort of views about the world. One is a benign one, and one is a slightly darker one. The benign one basically says that the world has never been in a better shape. You take peace, you take prosperity, you take democracy, you take respect for human rights, and those who support these ideas say that we have never seen such level of accomplishment in all these areas. If you take life expectancy around the world, we never had such promising prospects for our lives, certainly in developed countries, but also increasingly so in developing countries. Child mortality has gone down tremendously. Access to knowledge and information and education, technological developments, global solutions for global problems. And we are in an environmental school here. What we have achieved with the Paris Agreement is unheard of in the past. The Cold War is over. The number of wars around the world is much less important than it was decades ago. We lifted millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the last few decades. There is a new global middle class, and every day new people add to this middle class. And terrorism is there, of course, but if you look at the figures, and I came across an interesting figure of this benign school of thought about the situation in the world, which tells me that the victims of terrorism in America are less numerous than the victims of falling furniture in the US homes. So this is some elements of a benign view of the world today. There is a darker view of the world. And that view of the world tells us that basically the world is on the brink of chaos. There's no one in charge. Terrorists, refugees, migrants dominate the landscape, and no one cares about it, and no one controls that. The West is in decline, and the rest is not to be trusted. Politicians, businessmen are basically corrupt. We cannot trust them. And we people have to take care of things somehow. Our leaders are, by definition, weak, weaker than previous leaders. Terror is everywhere. Trade is bad for jobs. The only solution is close down our borders. This is a darker vision of the world that we also witness and that is present in the public debate. Of course, none of these two views are entirely accurate. None of these descriptions of the world is the right one. But there are elements of truth in both. Both of them describe parts of today's reality in the world. But they also translate or reflect not necessarily the reality, but the perception of reality that people have, that public opinion has. And as someone said before me, politics is a lot about perception. Decisions are very often, and I would say increasingly so, made upon perception. Emotions, feelings, rather than necessarily facts assessed against reality. So what can we do? What should we do, having as a background these two opposite views of the world, having in mind this intersection between reality and perception of reality? How should we proceed ourselves in trying to understand better where the world is today? Let me try to help you in a modest way to try to understand where we are. And I'll take three elements of analysis, which I believe are close to facts. There's a lot of discussion today about what facts are and what truth is. I won't get into that, I'll leave it to you. But this is my view of the facts, let's put it this way. The first one is that I think we are at the end of a cycle. What characterizes this cycle that, in my view, is closing down as we speak? These are 25, 30 years since basically around the fall of the Berlin Wall. And these years, these 2.5 decades, 3 decades, have been extremely rich, extremely fast. This is the period of what some economists call the hyper-globalization, where basically trade was growing faster than GDP, where China came of age, and grew at basically 2 digits per year. This is a time of an accelerated technological revolution that we are still witnessing today, which has created the basis for the next one, for the so-called fourth industrial revolution that is about to happen. This is the period of trade liberalization. This is a period of deregulation to some extent, in some areas more than others. This is a period of good growth of the world economy. It's also a period of increased mobility, exponential growth of mobility, of people, of goods, of services, capitals, never seen before. This is the period where social media emerged, where connectivity developed. All this happened in a short period of time. Historically, this is 2 minutes in history. I like to say that never so much happened that affected so many people in such a short period of time. This is a bad quote from Churchill, an adapted quote from Churchill. But if you realize, if you think a little bit, it's difficult to find 30 years where so much has changed. You know, the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Empire, countries in Eastern Europe coming into the European Union, opening up of China, developments in India, the BRICS, the emerging economies, the fall of a number of dictatorships, Southern America and beyond. You name it, a lot happened throughout this period, and in a very fast changing environment. I think it's very important to understand how much has changed in order also to understand how much resistance there may be to change, and how difficult it is for our societies to adapt to such an accelerated pace of change. I think this is something that we need to keep in the background if we want to understand some of the challenges we have today in our societies. The second point is exactly that one, huge changes during this period. Take the issue of power, for instance. I mean, we moved from a basically bipolar world during the Cold War to a unipolar world during a number of years where your country was predominant, to a situation today where we have an increasing multipolarity or apolarity or whatever you want to call it. But if you take a look at power more attentively, you see a transfer and a sharing and an erosion, a diffusion of power, moving from west to east, north to south, but also moving from governments, regulators, public authorities towards business, towards other actors in the society. You know, national governments lost power in face of globalization, for instance. A national regulator has less power today than it had before because the scale of the reality it has to deal with is not equipped to that scale. And we have not yet found an alternative level of regulation that compensates for the weakness of the national level. But we also have witnessed a diffusion of power from mediators, political parties, trade unions, different mechanisms of mediation within a society, and move from them to the individual, the empowering or the empowerment of individuals in our society. So this evolution of power is extremely interesting, and it characterizes to a large extent this period I'm trying to characterize. But you also had an enormous and fast-paced change in our societies, cultural changes, behavioral changes, the way we approach a number of issues that for many centuries were thought to be, just there. I'm talking about minorities' rights. I'm talking about LGBT rights. I'm talking about same-sex marriage. I'm talking about freedom of religion, the eclosion of new religions. All this as introduced in our societies, and sometimes we don't realize that if we don't step back a little bit and realize how much things have changed. Again, to try to better understand that adaptation is maybe sometimes a slower process than change. And this dichotomy, or this décalage, as the French would say, between change and adaptation is maybe a source of explanations for some of the problems we have today. The rise of diversity. It comes with not only the cultural changes, but also with the fact that we live in a global world, that we have access to information to a scale that we never had before. So what I'm saying here today can be heard in China as we speak. And what you are doing every day is having an impact around the world. The financial crisis was the vivid illustration of that. We realized very clearly that, a subprime mortgage in California could rock the entire financial system. And a strike in Chinese ports can disrupt the entire supply chain. A problem in a country that represents 2% of the European Union's GDP can create financial waves around the world. This is the kind of world we began to live with, or to live in the last 25 to 30 years. But also, the fact that we are living in a global public space. I mean, take the issue of inequality, for instance, which I will refer later on, but I was discussing with some of your professors earlier. Inequality is there. In some parts of the world it has widened, in some parts it has narrowed. But the biggest difference is that people are more aware of that inequality today than they were before. And this is a very important political factor that may be times, and we have not yet addressed them, or the heart of these problems, in a way that at the same time preserves freedom of communication and freedom of expression, but also ensures the balance of the public debate. Maybe we'll come back to that. And the third point I want to mention about this period, which has an enormous impact in what we live today and the world we live in today, is what happened in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, which I would call the recent turbulence. It basically starts in 2007, 8, 9 with the financial crisis, the economic crisis that was associated with it, the social crisis that was a consequence in some countries, which of course exacerbated some of the problems that were there, brought them to the surface, and made us realize that we had sort of to catch up with the changes. The whole debate, and I was in previous capacities involved in that, the work we tried to do in the G20 to address the financial crisis, was a clear evidence of an economic reality not matched by the governance, the required governance mechanisms to address it. It was followed by Syria. It's been 5 or 6 years that we are dealing with an extremely serious crisis in Syria. 500,000 people more dead out of this conflict. 10 million displaced people, more than 5 million refugees. And it's still ongoing. Aleppo today is a tragedy. And then we had Crimea, the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation, which we cannot accept, which we will not accept, but which represents the end of an understanding how the world should behave following the end of the Cold War. And then we had the eruption of ISIS, Daesh, a new form of terrorism, which qualitatively changed the fight against terrorism that we had been engaged before. The BRICS, the emerging economies, I mentioned as being one of the new realities of this period, in the last few years facing a number of problems. So the idea that some had that the West was decline and the emerging economies will be the future of our planet, is not exactly materializing, at least not in such a smooth way as one could have expected. We had the volatility in the commodities market in very pronounced ways, and we still faced with enormous problems in the banking sector around the world, in some countries more than others. And recently, even more recently, in fact, in the last semester, we had what I would call two political earthquakes, which came on top of all this. One was the referendum in the United Kingdom, determining the future withdrawal of the country from the European Union, and the other was, let's say, the unexpected result, according to polls, of the presidential elections in the United States. I'm not qualifying either of these events and their outcome. I'm just identifying them as relevant political events, which I compare to earthquakes. Because, like earthquakes, they were not necessarily foreseen. And like earthquakes, they can cause damage, they can cause change, and they can have repercussions. They can even have aftershocks. So they are, from a political science point of view, and maybe some political scientists in the room, they are extremely relevant. But again, I'm not qualifying, expressing any opinion about the result of the referendum or the result of the elections. That should be very clear. So this is where we are in terms of what I believe are three main elements that we should consider today if we want to understand where we are today. Again, the end of a cycle of huge, fast change in our societies. This change is having political, cultural, societal, economic, you name it, dimensions affecting all the aspects of our life and the organization of our societies. And we had recent turbulence that came on top of all that to make the motions. What are these fault lines in a, again, telegraphic way? It's global versus local. It's whether people think globally and want to live globally, or rather want to concentrate on a more local dimension. It's open versus close, whether we want to continue to have, or to keep this trend of openness of our societies, in cultural terms, in economic terms, in political terms, or if we want to close down, if we think that we open up too much and that we have to correct the cursor somehow. It's the tension between the center, the political center, and the two extremes, the far right and the far left. what is happening to the center? Can the center hold, like the poem would say? What is the center, by the way? Questions for discussion. It's the tension between pluralism and populism. Pluralism is acceptance of difference, diversity as a source of good for our societies, against populism, which is basically easy solutions for complex problems, and much more than that. But basically, a narrower approach to the way we organize our lives. It's liberal democracy versus, you can call it what you want, maybe authoritarian capitalism or authoritarian regimes, I don't know, where you combine certain elements of capitalism and where people try to prove that capitalism does not necessarily require a liberal democracy. This tension is there, this debate is there as well. There's a debate between multilateralism, which is what we try to do at the United Nations, which is based on the concept of cooperation instead of opposition or conflict, tension between multilateralism and the idea of spheres of influence, geopolitics at its worst. This fault line is also there. So a number of areas in which, the cleavage, the fault lines, I think is the best term I can find in my poor English, to define these tensions in our societies, where the debate is taking place, the confrontation is taking place, and where somehow, a new consensus must emerge. This means what? This means that some of the old assumptions that we had about the way we organize our countries and the world are obsolete somehow. The right-left divide. What is right and left today in our societies? Tell me, in your country, in our countries in Europe, how do you define right and left? I take the issue of trade, of free trade. The far left and the far right have exactly the same position. They don't want it. Exactly the same arguments. Difficult to distinguish what is left and where is right. The big ideologies of the 20th century are basically gone. That debate is over to a large extent. But we are struggling to find concepts that sort of organize our thoughts and organize ourselves around those concepts. It's very interesting because we are at the same time discussing very crucial, serious issues about the way we organize ourselves, but the conceptual side is not following. It's maybe a transition period, but a very interesting one. But all this creates space for, two realities that we see coming up very strongly. One is the role of religions in the political debate and the role of nationalism. And, let's see how this evolves, but it's part and it's linked to the evolution we've seen in the political debate. Another reality today, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, is the role of emotion and perception in the political arena, but also manipulation of emotions and perception. This is, you can tell me it happened all the time in politics since Rome and Greece and beyond, obviously so. This is part of human nature. But I think we are attaining degrees of relevance of these dimensions which we've never seen before. And this replaces reason, this replaces facts in our political discourse. It has to do with social media. It has to do with the different way we communicate among ourselves. It has to do with the simple fact, for instance, that we tend to listen only to the people we agree with. And we tend to read and tweet and retweet comfortably only with the people that we agree with. But this is not good, because we are crystallizing the differences. We are not reducing the difference. We are not approaching the opposite sides of an argument. You are crystallizing these boxes of understanding of reality. When I was, I don't want to talk too much about the United States, but I think this is a good example. Again, it happens in Europe as well. I was following the campaign in 2012. I was ambassador to the United States, and I went to some meetings, and in one day I went to both sides. And it was very interesting to see that in one side they were watching only one TV channel. On the other side they were watching only one TV channel. There were different TV channels. And this for me was an anecdotal, empirical illustration of a larger and much more important reality, which is that we increasingly live in silos, and it's not a very comfortable place to be in a silo, right? And it doesn't add and doesn't help finding the solutions that we need today. The issue of inequality is, I think, extremely important. And I think we have all overlooked it for too long, in the sense that, I think we thought that economic development, growth in trade, liberalization, growth will eventually solve all the problems, will eventually, spread out in more or less equal terms around our societies. That is not the case. We've seen globally a reduction in inequality, if you consider the overall big balances, equilibriums around the world. Again, we lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and that should not be underestimated as a positive result of the period I'm trying to describe. But we have increased inequality in certain countries, certain parts of the world, and we have not yet addressed that issue. In a way that increased inequality, which, by the way, is exacerbated by an increased awareness of that inequality because of the circulation of information, is now seriously threatening the very principle of globalization and the very principle of free trade and opening of our economies. So, for that reason, as much as for the very good reasons of addressing the issue of people living in difficult circumstances, I think this is one of the major issues that the international community needs to address, and soon. In the meantime, there is a world out there. There is a planet out there. And there, I think, this is something that is not changing, has not changed, and will not change. It's clear for me that the single most important thing that unites us is not a party, is not a tribe, it's not a gender, it's not a conviction, it's not a university, it's not a guru, it's not a god. What really unites us all is the fact that there is, so far, only one place in the universe where we can live, and that is called planet Earth. There is no planet B. So, this is a reality that has not changed in the last 30 years. It will not change unless we found a way to live in Mars, will not change in the next 30 years. It may change if we don't take care of it. It may change in the wrong direction, that we can no longer live in the only place where we are supposed to live in this universe. And this is, of course, the whole debate about climate change, pollution, biodiversity, you name it. And here again, in this area, this period that just preceded us has been extremely rich, and we have made enormous progress. And I think in this school of, very much linked to environment, we must recognize, we must rejoice about the fact that we made enormous progress in awareness and effective political action to fight climate change. We are a long way from what we had in the 60s and the 70s, where those of us, maybe those of you, who were talking about these issues were seen as radicals, eccentric, and worse things than that. This is now at the center of the political debate, the center of the political decision. I'm very proud of the European Union's role in all this. We have been pioneers. We started our first environmental action program in the European Union goes back to 1973. There were some important developments around those days also in the US, but with less obvious political consequences. So it is not that old. But we have today a global agreement on the fight against climate change. It's quite impressive. I remember very well in 2007, I was Chief of Staff of the President of the European Commission, which is a sort of European executive government. And we put together the first meaningful climate/energy package. And so we approved it among our member states, and then we started talking to our partners around the world. Because typically, there ain't much you can do about climate change if you don't do it together. So we started talking, and we were pretty much alone. I looked to my right, I looked to my left, I looked back, and I didn't see many people following us. We went to the G8, and apart from the Europeans, not much happening. Most of the people were in denial about climate change. And then progressively, gradually, we'll build up a case, and that's where we are today. Our approach is a mix of regulatory initiatives, legislation, market mechanisms, extremely important, and financial support for adaptation and otherwise. It's been successful. It's not been easy. Copenhagen was not a glorious moment. Paris was a great success. We have 2020 goals, 2030 goals, 2050 goals in the European Union. Paris Agreement is great, but it's not enough. First, we need to make sure that it is really implemented, and then we have to reassess and see how much we need to do. But first and foremost, we need to preserve the Paris Agreement. We need to make sure that it goes forward with a degree of consensus, international consensus, between developed and developing and emerging countries. This is a critical challenge that we need to focus on today. I was very happy, excuse me for this personal remark, I think it was in the beginning of October when I got a green light from Brussels to present the instruments of ratification by the European Union of the Treaty of Paris, of the Paris Agreement. And I went to the treaty room in the United Nations and officially presented the documents. And this very simple, modest fact, a guy in a dark blue suit looking, bureaucrat, whatever, giving a piece of paper to some other bureaucrat on the other side. This simple gesture triggered the entry into force of the Paris Agreement in the beginning of November. So this was very meaningful for me personally, very meaningful for the European Union, that those of us who were sort of pioneering the fight against climate change at the political and institutional level were also the ones that triggered the entry into force of the Paris Agreement. But it's not enough that it enters into force. We need to implement it. Today we have, I guess, 111 or 12 countries that ratify. This corresponds to more than 75% of the CO2 emissions around the world. If it stays like that, if it grows because other countries will ratify, because many other countries have signed, we are on the right track. And I'm encouraged by what I hear from everywhere that people intend to pursue on that track. This is the right track. So, as far as we are concerned, European Union, we did our homework, we inspired others, we led a coalition, we brought along the United States and China, critical elements of this coalition behind the fight against climate change. And now we have a deal, and the deal is now being implemented. Ministers met in Marrakesh a few days ago on the first ever meeting of the parties of the Paris Agreement. It's on track. It should go on. It makes a lot of sense. And it's a great victory of this period of the last 2 or 3 decades that we now need to make sure it comes to good results. So, benign view or darker view of the state of the world today? It's up to you to decide. I choose to be optimistic. I want to keep hope alive about our world. I trust the wisdom of mankind against all odds. I trust the commitment and the energy of the younger generation, which is well represented here tonight. I'm sure they would not let us down. And what my generation, the generations of my parents, those of us who lived after the war and built the world as it is today, I think we did a good job, to be very frank. We solved some problems, we created others. That's the nature of things. But I trust that we can, with the younger generation, build an even better world. I take this very meaningful award, the Chubb Award, and the fact that you invited me here as an additional incentive to continue my modest contribution at the United Nations, inside the European Union, to make this a better world. I'll trust that will be the case, that we will overcome the difficulties we have today, and that if you invite me in 5 years' time as a simple observer, we will have certainly a good discussion here about the fact that the world is, the benign view is maybe the one that we should endorse, and that will continue on the right track. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So the ambassador has generously agreed to take questions. I think when all of you walked into the auditorium, you should have received a card and a pencil. So I ask now that you fill out your questions, and one of the aides will come and collect, and I will be stationed over there to read your question. So I will return the podium to the ambassador.
Thank you.
So, is this on? So while we're waiting, I do have a question to start us off, if you are ready. Have you caught your breath?
Absolutely.
So I too would love to be in the camp of the benign view and the optimistic view. So I would love to hear a little bit more about the last point you left us off with the Paris Agreement and what more. I would love to hear a little bit more about the question of corporate power and the concerns about the ways in which multinationals may or may not comply with the Paris Agreement and reduction of emissions. So I'm curious if you think that there is a particular challenge that extends beyond the diplomatic community, but most certainly in terms of the corporate business communities, and how to get compliance as you create that lovely image of bureaucrats passing paper. I would love to hear more about the mechanisms of compliance and control that you're envisioning if we are imagining a world where the benign view and that the Paris Agreement will indeed go forward and it will be ratified fully. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the issue is, and it's a little bit the history of the European Union and our successes. It's a combination of, sort of top-down regulatory legislative action, which is absolutely indispensable, with market mechanisms and market common sense. I think what we managed to do inside the European Union, for instance, bringing together energy and climate, was to create the right, let's say, narrative, the right case, the right concept for the economic operators, which is the ones you're referring to understand where their interest would lie. And I think what we're doing with climate change today, if you take the case of China, for instance, is the understanding that there are benefits to be gained by embarking in this new process. So it's not only compliance in the sense of top-down regulatory pressure on economic operators, is the combination of that with the actual interest of the economic operators. That's why I'm so confident that the Paris Agreement will evolve, because there is a strong economic case for it. And you have to couple the Paris Agreement with another very interesting product of the multilateralism, which is the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17, and I invite you to read them. I'm always impressed when I go back to these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It's a wonderful agenda. And if we implement all that, the world is certainly going to be a better place in a few years' time. But if you combine the two, you have a very strong economic case for the development of a green economy, to the development of a sustainable way of using our resources. And, come on, it's very difficult to live in Beijing and New Delhi these days with the degree of environmental pollution. And it's not me coming from a developed world in a nice blue suit saying this to people suffering there. It's them saying that they don't want to live like that. And the political pressure will be such, and is already such, in these and other countries, to the political authorities to move in the right direction. I think the evolution of China, which I praise here, as far as climate is concerned, is a good illustration of that. They moved from a situation in which, back in the early days of the climate negotiations, where they basically were saying, you made it, you have to pay. Full stop. To a position in which they understand we did not necessarily make it for a number of decades, even centuries, but we are certainly making it now, and we want to benefit from this new phase, leapfrog, move forward in terms of the use of new technologies, create a new environment that will help our environment. And I think this change in the Chinese position, which again I praise, is a good illustration of how reality comes to haunt you, and reality imposes on you a number of political choices. So I think a combination of regulatory pressure and economic evidence of benefit on the medium and long term will bring us to the right situation.
Okay, I now have a lot of questions. So apologies if we do not get to your question. I'll do my best to get through these. So testing your skills as a diplomat at this point. What kind of influences from the American campaign result to Asian countries, especially China? I think the question maybe affect Asian countries, especially China. How do you think China and other Asian countries will be getting involved in sustainable development goals? You start to explain a little bit of that.
No, I think what I see with my Chinese colleagues in New York at the United Nations is a very strong engagement of China in the multilateral system. I think there has been a change. The way the Chinese diplomats engage in all the discussions, their commitment to our core agenda. We have our differences, of course. Let's be clear about that. But as far as multilateralism is concerned, as far as the role of the UN is concerned, you know that China is becoming very fast the most important financial contributor to the United Nations. They are very active on peacekeeping operations and in many other areas. And again, I saw the report of the meeting of the next Secretary General of the United Nations, which, by the way, is a Portuguese citizen. Thank you. And an excellent person, and you'll be an excellent Secretary General. The reports of his meeting in China yesterday and the day before, look at that, because it shows a great deal of convergence between China and the United Nations agenda. Again, we have our differences in a number of areas, but I'm confident that China will play an increasingly important role in the multilateral system, including on the climate change agenda and the sustainable development goals.
So there are several questions here that are about the EU specifically, and particularly around, I assume these are coming out of questions around Brexit, but I'll read a couple of them.
What a surprise.
In a climate of Euroscepticism, what do you see as the future of the European project? And what would you say to the claim that the international order is increasingly technocratic and undemocratic?
Well, first of all, I've been working for the European Union, I think, now for 30-something years, so you don't expect me to say this is not a good idea. I actually think it's a great idea. I think the construction of the European Union is the most significant conflict prevention, peace building, and peacekeeping operation in the history of mankind. You can quote me on this. It's a nice quote, by the way. But in fact, if you see that we were able to bring, all the generations that contributed to it. Think of where Europe was after the Second World War. Think of where Europe is today. We started with 6 countries, we now have 28. We brought all the countries that were behind the Iron Curtain into a democratic space. Countries like Portugal and Spain or Greece that lived with right-wing dictatorships. I lived 17 years in a dictatorship. So don't tell me that that is not an issue. It is an issue. And this is what the European Union did. We raised the levels of prosperity, security, social protection, education in our societies. We have today more than 500 million people living in a framework of democracy, no death penalty, individual freedom, rule of law, market economy, strong social protection and education system, environmental awareness and concern and action. This is what the European Union is today. And it is still appealing to a number of countries. Take the Balkans. The prospect of European accession, or accession to the European Union, is the single most important driver of reconciliation and change in the Balkans. Take Ukraine. You saw huge demonstrations with this flag, more than you see in the European capitals, by the way. So a good example from our Ukrainian friends. You see that the idea is still alive. Do we have problems? Of course we have problems. Don't you? We all have problems. I mean, our countries are difficult to manage. The world is in a difficult place today, as we discussed earlier. Of course we have problems, but I don't think we have a better solution than staying together. I mean, someone said one day that all European countries are equal. The difference being that all the European countries are small. The difference is that some have not yet realized that. And the fact is that if you look at the global scale, I mean, all the European Union countries are too small to face the challenges we have today. But together we can count. We are the most important economic bloc in the world still today. More than 500 million people. And so I'm confident that we will overcome whatever problems, and we have had a few in the past few years, as we had in the past. But I want to stress one point that sometimes is a little bit overlooked. Our process is an incremental one. That is, we move forward as we can. We move forward from maybe one crisis to the other, maybe from one opportunity to the other. We don't have a blueprint that says, back in 1957, we're going to do this, this, and that with this. No. We moved forward as the conditions were favorable for that. We slowed down here, we accelerated there, and we overcame one crisis here and one crisis there. And so I'm very confident that the European Union will stay for very long. But we need to address some important issues that are there. Some are common to the United States. The rise of populism, for instance, we discussed it earlier. Some structural economic issues, an aging society, the issue of competitiveness, demography, you know them. Some of them you have here as well. But I think the sense of belonging to a common project, the sense of not being able really to exercise our full sovereignty in total isolation is a very strong one. On Brexit and the consequences of Brexit, some people were expecting this to be, to trigger a downgrading of the acceptability or the enthusiasm or the support for the European Union. The polls show the opposite. There has been an increase in support for the European Union since the referendum. I'm not addressing the issue of the United States elections' consequences on the world because I leave that to you.
So some of these questions regard your work and your role. In particular, as a EU ambassador to the UN, how hard is it to reach a common position among the 28 members of the EU? Do you see your role as a facilitator of different positions or more as working towards a specific EU vision?
Well, very interesting question. Try to describe my role. I first have to maximize the impact of the European Union by maximizing the capacity that we have of agreeing on common positions. That is my first role when I wake up, is to make sure that all my 28 sort of more or less go in the same direction. And that's a very stimulating thought every morning in front of the mirror. And we actually do achieve quite a lot. You know, the most recent statistics show that more or less that we vote the same way, that we have a common position on more than 93 or 94% of the votes that take place or the positions that we have to take. This is incredibly successful. We're talking about 28 countries spread out in a continental scale with different cultures, different languages, different traditions, different economic interests, different dimension, coming together around the same position. So this is my first, and my team, of course, role. And for that I chair and host a weekly meeting of all the ambassadors, and my colleagues, they keep on meeting all their colleagues. We do, you know, more than 1,000 meetings a year of coordination. This is the process. And then the second stage is when we have a common position, I go to the Security Council and speak on behalf of the 28, or to the General Assembly. And my colleagues negotiate with others on the basis of 28. So we represent 28. And this is very interesting, very stimulating, it's an honor to do that. When I speak in the Security Council on behalf of 28, not bad. I think my father would be proud. And sometimes, most of the time, we have a number of other countries that align themselves with our position. So sometimes I'm speaking on behalf of 35 and more countries. So this rallying power of the European Union, because we provide the example, is very strong. And so I'm optimistic about the future. I'm very happy to do the work I do. It's not easy sometimes, but it's very rewarding when we get there. And most of the time we do get there.
Speaking of security, one of the questions is, could you talk about security risks the EU currently faces and I think this is, and the EU Army in the near future, and possible creation of the EU Army.
Yeah, we are not planning to have an EU army. That's not in the plans. What we are doing, and today, as we speak, or a few hours ago in Brussels, we came out with a number of proposals, what we call European Defence Action Plan, which is basically about not creating a European army. Again, this is not in the books. This is not our goal. The goal is to strengthen the cooperation and the links among European Union armies, the armies of the member states, creating an economic space for defense procurement, for instance, so that we concentrate our meager budgetary means in a more efficient way, so better output with more or less the same input. This is what we're talking about, efficiency, effectiveness of our defense effort. Because, first part of your question, we are facing new security threats. And this is part, I didn't have time to develop that, but this is part of what has been happening in the last few years. You know, during the Cold War, we knew our enemy. We knew what they looked like, we knew their names. With a few spies, we could know a little bit more than that as well. So this was a very familiar environment, right? It was very comfortable in a way. You know, there was always this nuclear threat above our heads, but it was quite predictable in a certain way. What is the situation today? I mean, most of the time, we don't know who we are fighting. We don't know their faces, we don't know their names, they don't even have a territory, they don't even have an army, they don't even have an ambassador we can talk to. I mean, it's a very different sort of situation that we have today. And if you look at Europe today, we have a sort of ring of fire around us. You start in Ukraine, Crimea, you go through Syria, Iraq, Libya, Northern Africa. I mean, it's not an easy place. And it's our backyard. It's our backyard. You know, I won't say this one. But I see Morocco from my kitchen window in the Algarve. Not referring to anybody else. Just an idea that came to me. But that's the reality. We are very close to our neighborhood. You know, you see the migration problem. People cross a few miles in the Mediterranean and they are in Italy, Malta, Spain. So this is a reality there. The terrorism threat upon Europe is even bigger than upon the United States, as we unfortunately know. So we need to address all this. We want to address it in full complementarity with NATO. There be no doubts about that. This is not an alternative to NATO. This is a complementarity to NATO. So I think there are new security risks, there is new security awareness and new political initiatives taking place in Europe, but not towards an EU army.
So these two questions follow up one aspect of what you just described, the challenges of refugees, for example, and security. I'll read both of them. The EU prides itself on the concept of open borders that helps form the foundation of the single market. Is the movement of refugees jeopardizing this principle? Is adding Turkey the answer to the EU's refugee movement problems? And then the other question is similar, is the free movement of persons a non-negotiable prerequisite of access to the single market?
Yeah, many questions in your question. Let's take the refugees situation. So we should not underestimate the importance and the complexity of what we have been facing in the last 2 or 3 years and still face today. There's first a humanitarian dimension. So people are dying in the Mediterranean, people are dying in crossing towards Europe. And our first concern has been to save lives in the Mediterranean, for instance, to create the best possible conditions for that, to fight smuggling, because people are making money out of the sufferance of refugees and migrants. And this is something that we need to address as a matter of priority, and that is what we have been doing. The other issue is, of course, how do we accommodate this influx of people coming to Europe? And this is a more complex problem because of the nature of our system. We have 28 countries with different degrees of awareness, experience of diverse societies. And some of our countries simply don't have that awareness or that experience or that capability in political terms to move as fast as others in addressing these issues. So there's a need for us to find the right balance between different positions. The other issue is that you would not solve the issue of refugees and migrants simply at the destination end of the problem, right? It has at least two other dimensions, the transit countries and the origin countries. So we need to look at the root causes of this migration flow. One of them is the crisis in Syria. That's why we have been so active in trying to support political solution for the Syrian problem. We have supported the UN in their efforts. We have engaged ourselves very actively into this. But other root causes is the underdevelopment in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, which is the source of many of these migrants. So what we are developing right now is new creative arrangements with transit and origin countries in order to address the problem in its entirety. And we made an agreement with Turkey, which is working well. And we are now in a new generation of agreements with origin countries, namely a number of Northern African, some sub-Saharan countries as well. And this is what we'll do in the future, to concentrate on that. And the deal is basically, let's help those countries create the jobs for the people who are looking for jobs in Europe. And in doing so, share with them both the responsibility of addressing the problem, but also the benefits of economic redress. So this is a complex reality requiring complex solutions. On the Brexit question about free circulation, I think we are not yet there, right? Let me briefly address the Brexit issue because I know it's important for you. First of all, we respect the choice of the British voters. It was a democratic choice. We have nothing to say about it. If you want our opinion, I think the majority of us on the continent would have preferred the British people to stay in the European Union. I certainly do think that would have been better for the European Union, and I believe also better for the United Kingdom, but I'm not British. The British have the right to decide. So full respect for the democratic decision. Secondly, we are, to a large extent, in uncharted waters. Never before had a country requested to leave the European Union. And we introduced a provision in the present treaty, in the Lisbon Treaty, beautiful city, by the way, that you should that you should visit one day, if we have not yet done so. But the Treaty of Lisbon has, for the first time in the history of the European Union, a provision addressing the possibility of a country leaving the European Union, which is the famous Article 50. And the article basically says that a country that wishes to do so, to leave the European Union, has to trigger that article through a formal request for the starting of negotiations. And these negotiations should take place during a period of 2 years, after which, if there is an agreement, the agreement is implemented. If there is no agreement, the country will have to leave anyway. This Article 50 has to be triggered by the country that wants to leave, not by those who want to stay, obviously. And the United Kingdom has not yet triggered that article. And so we are not discussing any issue formally with them until they do so. The Prime Minister announced that they will do so sometime in March of next year. We are waiting for that to happen. In the meantime, no formal negotiations take place. So it's very difficult for me to anticipate positions in that negotiations, but I'm of course aware of the debate that is taking place. You know, we have a set of rules in our system. This set of rules is consistent, is coherent. It encompasses a number of elements, of which 4 fundamental freedoms are interlinked, and including the free circulation of people. So in abstract, it's very difficult to imagine that we can disentangle these 4 freedoms in a way that is still coherent with our treaties. But that's as far as I can go now, because the issue is not yet on the table. We don't know yet how the United Kingdom wants to approach it, and I don't want to prejudge on their position.
Okay, so we're down to our last few questions and almost out of time. 2 of the questions want to take up the question of the benign versus darker view that you've laid out. I'll ask one of these questions first. Vladimir Putin seems like a malevolent force. Is there something you can tell me about him that will ease my mind? And I'm not asking that question. Someone else out there is asking. But I wouldn't mind easing my mind, too.
Well, I think it's up to him to reply to that question. Yeah. think I'll stop there. I think I'll stop there. No, I mean, just, in the confidence of this room, which is, by the way, it's being streamed, so, and maybe translated into Russian. No, I mean, the relationship with Russia for Europeans is very important. I mean, because if there is one thing you cannot change is geography. They will be our neighbors, will be their neighbors. And we have thousands of kilometers of, border with Russia. And we have, economies that are quite interlinked, and history and the culture and all that. So there is a future for EU-Russia relations. We are going through slightly difficult times for reasons you well know, but I'm sure we will find ways to first separate issues, not linking issues which are not necessarily linked, stick to our values and our principles, and state them very clearly. But in areas where we can cooperate well, we are ready to continue to cooperate. Take the Iran deal, for instance, where the cooperation between us and Russia and the US and China was critical to allow the deal that we reached with Iran. And we did this at the same time where we're having very difficult discussions with the Russians about Ukraine and Crimea. So I think there's ways and means for us to find the balance, but we will never compromise on a number of principles, as I've said earlier.
So I think a follow-up to that is, given the benign versus darker views you spoke about, how do you view the responsibility of the EU to protect these values that you're speaking of, so that they may continue to evolve and be applied in the future?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to be credible, you have to be coherent. If you compromise on your values, how can you be an advocate for those values towards the rest of the world? Is as simple or as complicated as that. And so I think we will stick to the formula that in order to be coherent, we need to be credible, and vice versa. So we'll see us, you continue to see us on the forefront of the fight for human rights, wherever the issue or the violation of those rights takes place. You will find us, as we have, and we just finished some work in the UN on the committee that deals with human rights, and we were leading the fight on death penalty, on DPRK, on freedom of religion and belief, on a number of areas in which, on the rights of the LGBT community. All that on the rights of women, children. I mean, we are on the front of those rights. And for us to be effective there, we need to be absolutely coherent on the internal front, as we are today. For instance, you cannot be a member of the European Union if you have death penalty in your country. As simple as that. If you do not uphold fully human rights. So these are fundamental pillars of our construction.
I think on that strong note, this is a good place to end. And thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.